All right. Am I back? I don't know. I have no information on this. All right, I am back. Okay. Yeah, I don't know why. Restream just kicked me out. Kicked me out entirely. I was still streaming here. You've made so much information and you're never getting it back. All right, so I was talking about, all right, well, anyhow, yes, you can use Dynamesh, you can use Sculptris Pro anyway through your process. You definitely don't have to stick with one. You can definitely go back and forth and project as needed. So here, back to the armor here, you can see I have ZRemeshed this. So I've ended up coming through and ZRemeshing this. After you have it ZRemeshed once, you can do it again just to get it lower. Now the main thing I want here is that I want to have a nice symmetry line through the model. So you want to make sure that exists. So I have a little pin here. Let's ZRemesh this one more time, see if I can get it to go away. And this is a key thing that you want to do here because when I position this on my model, it's no longer going to be in the center of the world. And this is going to give me issues, per se, if I want to sculpt symmetrically on that mesh. So right now I can sculpt left to right, but as soon as I rotate it off to the side, then that model is not going to allow me to get that symmetry back. So after I have this ZRemeshed, I now have a nice symmetrical model, so all the points should be equal across the whole area there. I can now divide this up by just coming over here, and I want to divide it up roughly to where I had the polygon count on my other model. So here I have the original one, and that was at 227, and then this one is at 77. So I just want to divide this up till it's around that number. And now what I want to do is I want to project the details from my high one to my low one. So I'm going to make sure I have my high one visible, and then I'm going to make sure I have this duplicated one here. And then I'm going to go to the project tab here, change my distance, and then click project all. And so there we go there. And if I turn on solo and turn off perspective, you can see now I have my model and it has been reprojected. And since I made that low res version of it, I now have subdivisions, so I can go up and down. And you can see those subdivisions are being generated across the mesh. So this is a big thing here, because basically what I did was I remeshed it. And with the remesh, I have a low res version now that has nice symmetry. And then I have all the details projected back. So now what I can do is, let me go over to this mesh here. Actually, let me see if I have the version here with this. Actually, we'll just take this and move it onto my mesh here. So now I'm gonna go back to my concept that we kind of flushed out in the last one. And with this, I just want to make sure that his body is here. So let me just turn that off there, and we'll go and grab this one. And then I'm just going to append in that ZRemeshed version of the armor. Now you'll see with this here, make sure it's on, is that I can move this. So I can come over here and move this into position here. So symmetry is turned off here. I can now scale this, reposition it, and just basically fit it where I want it on my character here. Now also during this, since I have those low res subdivisions, I can now make large scale changes as needed too. So I can step down to that low one, and now if I get, say, a move brush with a pretty big size here, I can come through and start deforming this to make sure this armor fits all the way around, right? So I can pull out these sides a little bit, pull this down, and this is all just that same model. So I've just reduced down to that subdivision level 1, and now I can move it around. Now you'll notice that now my mesh is positioned, right? And now it's also not off on center anymore either. So I've not only gone through and rotated it and repositioned it so it's no longer in the center of the world, but I've also skewed one side from the other. So this mesh is entirely, if you look at it, non-symmetrical, right? So what we can do is now, if I want to sculpt a detail on this side and this side, if I turn on symmetry, you can see this is what's happening, right? So So if I try to sculpt here, it's sculpting over there. If I try to sculpt here, it's sculpting there. Now I could try to activate local symmetry, which will use the kind of local symmetry of the bounding box of the model, which sometimes works if the model is just positioned off in an even distance left or right. But you'll see with this model, it's still not going across, right? So there's an option in ZBrush up here, and it's called Use Posable Symmetry. So this is why when I ZRemeshed, I wanted to make sure that I had a center line and symmetry on that model. So it ZRemeshed at that low resolution, got me a clear symmetrical line, and then projected the details back. And this allows me now to use posable symmetry. So now if I come up here and activate this, you can see now if I sculpt on my model, it's sculpting on the other side as well. So this is a big thing, especially if you're doing things like this, where I modeled it statically, I got my base shapes in, but then after I get it on the model, I may want to change stuff, okay? And so instead of changing it twice, I can use that posable symmetry. And now as I sculpt on this, you can see it's going to adhere to the underlying structure of the mesh. So it's looking at the vertices and edges in relation to the model itself. So even with the distortion I did, say pulling the backside up more on one side than the other, as long as this vertex over here is in the same place over there, that is the relation it's going to give me for that sculptural mark. So that is how you can come through and use sculptural symmetry for your advantage there. Now with this, I do it pretty much for anything that's hard surface on this because I wasn't quite sure exactly when I was done with it. Basically, I knew that I wanted the armor to look a certain way, and so I started it. But then as I added more details and different things to the mesh, like different assets, I wanted to make sure I had a consistency of things that were the same size. So if I made a hole here on this part of the model, I wanted to make sure that that hole was the same size as it would be somewhere else. So I didn't want to fully commit to the armor being completely done before I started fleshing out the other areas. So Randy, I was just showing the posable symmetry stuff. So I have a model. This was my model here. And just to cover this really quick is I had my high res. I then ZRemeshed it. So I had a version that was low, and this has a clearly defined symmetrical axis. So you can see the vertices on this side and that side are clearly symmetrical. I then divided this back up, and after it was divided, I then projected the details from my high-res one, the one that was the Dynamesh, back onto it. Then I took that model and I just quickly placed it on my character, and then I used the move brush to move things around. So I can reposition things. This one got raised a little bit because I needed to clear this top shoulder, and then I had to pull this out and open this a little bit back. So it's not fully symmetrical across the entire sculptural surface. And then after I had that changed, I then went back up to its high subdivision level here. And if I just turn on symmetry normally, you'd see that it wasn't going to work. So if I try to sculpt it here and here, you see it's not going to give me that symmetrical axis. But then I could go to the transform palettes, and in here there is a use posable symmetry. And this will allow you to, it's going to scan that underlying subdivision one that had that clear defined symmetrical. It's going to find those points correlated across that center line. And now with posable symmetry activated, if I sculpt, it's going to sculpt on the other side as well. So that was the thing there. So you can ZRemesh before posing too. That would be an excellent choice because definitely, as long as you have a clearly defined symmetrical line, and the lower you take it, it's going to be easier for ZBrush to find, is the basic thing there. So if you have a Dynamesh, you could use mirror and weld on it, and it would give you that center line. But when you come up and do the calculation for use posable symmetry, if your mesh is really dense, it could either take a while or you may not be able to find all the points exactly. So if you do a ZRemeshed model that has that clearly defined center line and isn't too high res, then it's a lot easier for ZBrush to find that posable symmetry, and that's a lot easier to use. And with that, let me move this here. Let's move this down here. I'll show you another example of this as well. Wait for it. Come on, load. So here I have a helmet. here's the helmet here. And this one is the kind of fleshed out one here. So I've gone through and I detailed the horns a little bit. He also has a bunch of layers of glass and some inner parts as well. So I knew I wanted this helmet to kind of give this glowy effect too. So I have some, you know, assets here that will come through definitely on rendering time and give me different effects. So I have these kind of glowy bits that I've modeled in as well. And then with this, I have two panes of glass. So I have an inner pane and an outer pane that I end up doing. And this is just for when I get into key shot and render, it'll give me a different effect for what I'm kind of looking for. And then oftentimes, if I'm modeling and I know I'm gonna render it, I'll do a lot of things where I'll double up subtools just so they're there. And this allows me to create a subtool that has an emissive quality to it, so it glows. And then I can put other subtools in front of it that will end up blocking it. And that will give me kind of fogs or you know, glow effects I can have across surfaces too. So there's always little things like that that I'll end up doing. So if you see, you know, in my subtool list here, if you can see, well, why do you have two glasses? It's usually for rendering purposes. So with this part of the model here, this is the kind of the area here. And one thing that I didn't add yet that I need to add in is, so I like this kind of line tracing. And so as I was working on the model, this tracing happens a lot on my stuff as well. And so for the helmet, it's one of the areas that I need to go in and add that tracing to. And so my process for doing this is I have a standard brush that I kind of modified, and basically all it is a standard brush, and it has lazy mouse turned on and then has its lazy radius set to 50, and I use it at a really small size. And I use this for clothing edges. So if I have any areas where there's like seams, let me see, I got a camera there, there you go, like this on clothing, you can see there's like this little, there's always a rim, right, on any seam. And so I'll use this brush to enhance that. And I'll also use it to carve into surfaces, which gives me kind of panel line effects. So with the helmet frame here, if I just isolate it, you can see this is what it ended up with. And so this was just a quick Dynamesh sculpt that I then went in and used the H-polish stuff to polish out those edges. And then I Z-remeshed it. So same process I did for the armor. So this was the Z-remeshed version here. And then I subdivided it up and I positioned it on my character. And now, once again, if I try to just activate symmetry normally, I come in and try to sculpt, you see it's not going to be symmetrical. So going back up to the transform palette here, using that posable symmetry, and that found that symmetrical points. And now, for any kind of things that I do that's kind of like armor related, I usually like hitting up the edges, as I mentioned. And this also just brings another light hit or a light source from it. So even if Scott's drawing didn't have this kind of design already on it, I probably end up doing it anyway. So it's just one of those things I kind of like. And so what I do with this, I'll take a really small draw size, and then I'll come through and I'll just hold down the Alt key, make sure my texture map isn't on here, and I'll just trace the borders here. Now, one thing nice with the lazy mouse is that it's pretty forgiving, so you can go pretty slow, and I'll just trace around. Now you could do a continuous stroke, which can be done with some of the chisel brushes inside of ZBrush, but I usually just end up using this brush. And then if I get, say, like a divot like this through here, I'll just hit it quickly with smooth, and that usually takes it out. And I'll just trace, you know, these areas. And usually I trace the hard edges of the different things. So like for this mesh here, I'd probably follow up this as well. This is hidden on the model itself, but I'd end up doing, you know, something like this just to kind of get an extra panel surface through there. And so I'll do this a lot. And it doesn't have to be super clean, especially if, you know, the model is going to be viewed at, say, you know, this size. Your line doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be readable at that distance. And that's another thing too with ZBrush. As you're doing stuff in 3D, you can keep going and going and going and zooming in as close as possible as you want. And that's one of kind of the downsides too. Because basically, you know, if I keep adding geometry and I keep zooming in, I can keep adding more and more details to my mesh. I can keep going and going and going. But if your model is only going to be this big in relation to like what you see in real life, there's no point in making those details that in depth. So definitely just think about that as well as you're modeling things. And so that would be kind of what I end up doing there. And then I'd also, oftentimes I don't like the transitions, direct transitions between shapes. So I'd end up hitting these two as well. And so even just adding a little carved detail just to the edge where that other one hits, just breaks up that surface just a little bit more, and it doesn't make it so obviously computer generated, I guess. It just makes it look like it has like another little element to it. So just adding that stuff there as well. And then there's also some tricks you can do for different things too. So if you find out that you did a depth detail pass on your model, but then you find out later that needs to be deeper, you can definitely do some tricks with layers too, and that you can take a layer, create it, smooth the heck out of that layer, and then apply a morph target, and you can actually enhance your details through layering too. So if I found out that, hey, these horns here, they were too soft after it was 3D printed, instead of resculpting them all in and trying to get that depth, you can do some morph target layer tricks and get that amped up more, and so that would just spike enough to get it to read at certain sizes. So that is the helmet there. And then for the horns, this was all Sculptris Pro for these here. So this was that kind of decimation process that I'll also do as well. So if I turn on my polyframes here, let me just isolate this quick. You can see this is all Sculptris. And so for anything organic, this is what I'll end up doing. So I'll come in and I'll sculpt with Sculptris enabled. And this usually ends up giving me a really clear, clean stroke. And then if my model gets too heavy, so after I reach a certain point, I'll come to that Z plugin tab, I'll run it through Decimation Master, and I'll show you guys this. And so that is the Z-remeshed. So that took it from this, which was 780 points, to that, which was 74. And I'm switching between these two. So you can see I'm switching between this, and you don't see any change. So oftentimes when you're sculpting, you can definitely reduce it with decimation and you're not gonna notice the difference. So there's the wireframe there between those two. And so now that it's low again, now I can go back to using Sculptris Pro, and it's gonna handle a lot smoother because there's less topology on the model. And so this is kind of my workflow for stuff like this. I'll just sculpt until it starts getting sluggish, and then I'll decimate it back down, and then sculpt some more and decimate it back down, and I'll just keep going like that. Now there will be a point if you're trying to do an entire model with Sculptris Pro that you may end up running into where you have too much decimation, so then you can break things off into parts. So I definitely end up, as you can see here, each of these horns are out on their own separate subtool. So each of these is using Sculptris Pro and then decimating it down and going back and forth. So now let's see what else we got here. So now I got hoses that I want to hit on next. So let's go over here. People seem to like the haircut. It's every single time I stream, I have a different hair effect. I think that's kind of the topic of my streaming. So Saeed's asking, is there a way to use Sculptris Pro after Z-remesh? So yeah, you can always just Z-remesh and then turn on Sculptris Pro and it's gonna work. The only thing you're gonna lose if you're trying to do Z-remeshing for that posable symmetry, as soon as you go in and start using Sculptris Pro in that model, you're gonna break that symmetry because you're adding triangles and it's no longer be symmetrical on both sides. So you won't be able to use posable symmetry anymore. So one caveat for that. Connor's asking, could you remesh that before unwrapping, then bake the details? Yes, absolutely. So you could definitely duplicate that subtool out. You could then remesh it, which would give you a low-res version. Take that, unwrap it, divide it up, and then project the other subtools details onto that one. And then you have your model with subdivisions and also UVs. And you can then generate neural maps or displacement maps out of ZBrush or send them out for external baking. Question for UVing stuff. So basically for anything for UVing, you can definitely use, there's an automatic unwrapper here in UV Master, and this will allow you to unwrap. Basically, if you want to unwrap everything all together, you'd have to merge them. So the unwrap process here will give you one map per subtool, and that's pretty much what ZBrush can only uses is you can only have one set of UV coordinates per subtool. Stitching on the legs I have not covered yet, so I'll go into that here in a minute, but I want to show this. I got a few things here lined up, and then if we have time we can go to tangents. So Mark's looking for stitching. My fiber mesh beard goes back and forth. It takes a little while to grow, and then it goes away. All right, so here I have some wires here, and so for this, in the initial kind of thoughts that I was going through in terms of the designs that I wanted to hit on, I was looking into that pressure and that kind of flight suit stuff. So this is like MIG era flight suits. So they have these kind of tubes that come across, and then there's also this webbing. So I wanted this kind of attribute where his suit is also pressurized, and so dealing with those pixels, dealing with those depth, I wanted to hit on that kind of stuff. And I also liked just the standard design of this. I knew that I wasn't going to flesh it out 100% to be exact, but I wanted some elements of that. And so the elements I wanted to make sure I kind of had in here was we have this tube that's going around, and then we also have these kind of little ribbed assets as well. And then as you can see here on the mesh, we have these kind of cord areas through here that can be tightened up or loosened or allow that kind of pressure or that flex. So those are kind of what these are happening through here. Now for the kind of tubes here, basically what I do with these is I'll take them and just use an insert mesh brush, and I just draw them out. And then after I have these drawn out, I end up unwrapping them. So I'll use UV Master usually initially for these, and then I end up running them through Headless UV Layout is my tool of choice for kind of doing UVs, and this will get them all nice and flat and straight. And so after I have these laid out, if I just apply a random texture to this, actually we'll do this instead. I can then start applying different patterns to it. So I use surface noise a lot for this, and so if I come to the noise area here and open this up and go to edit, you can see I have this kind of slightly kind of not white and black pattern already loaded in. And with this, you can see it's coming across, and it's going to apply across that surface based on those UVs. Now in here I can scale this up and down to change the size, and then after this is kind of applied, if I turn on I'm getting this kind of light kind of pattern to this here. Now I didn't amp this up, I didn't make this super powerful because I didn't want it to overshadow the other process I want to do next. And so with this, I just kept it light, and then in this stage, I also kept it on for the majority of the time. I did not bake it in. So this is just usually kept as a preview, and this allows me just to kind of work with this and see if it's going to do what I want to do with this hose. So I know in general, like these kind of hose thing here, it has this kind of wrinkle stuff through here. So if I really wanted it to, match this, I would have gone in and sculpted wrinkles across this area here. But at this stage, I just wanted not a straight tube, so it didn't look like this. I wanted a little undulation on the surface. And once this is printed out, this may be lost entirely. So that's why I kept it as an active surface noise option there. And so with that, that is kind of the first hose there. And if I go back to my model, you can see that's kind of what it ended up there. And now for the second hose, this is the one that's a little bit trickier, right? So I have these coils. So if I go to that hose here, this is what I kind of did. So I took the first hose and I basically just moved it. So I went through, I moved the position using the move brush. Oops, I'm closing the menu here. And then I went down to deformation, and I did an inflate. So I made it just a little bit bigger with this. And that's gonna take all those polygons and push them out. So now I have a second tube that's a duplicate of the first, so it has the same UV coordinates, but then it's been pushed out a little bit more, and I've offset it. So you can see as I've come across here, I've kind of moved it off, so it's kind of sticking into the other one, but it's not following it. And this is gonna give me this effect of this kind of ribbing stuff through here. Now with the ribbing stuff, if I go now into surface noise here, oh, went too far, hold on, I turn that off. This is what I have initially is my tubes. And I have another map that I'm gonna load in here quick. And this is just another black and white alpha. And so you can make these pretty much anywhere. Basically, for this one, I just did Photoshop. And this is all the alpha map is. So it's white, black, white, black, white, black, and I just tiles. That's all I did here. Now with this loaded in, I can now come over here, and if I start adjusting my strength here, I can start doing that and changing my scale. And you can start seeing it apply on the mesh. This is giving me a very similar kind of effect that I had to that original one, right? So I'm just getting this kind of, you know, little bump to my hose. Now I can increase this and get a lot more, but it's basically just not doing much different than that first one, right? So the power here is that what I can do now is I can offset this noise and clip out or cull out any dark areas on this alpha. And so I'll use this a lot for just modeling different things that has a lot of details. So if you ever seen, I've got a bunch of robot stuff that I've done, and I usually will Dynamesh the heck out of it. And then I'll duplicate that subtool and then apply these alphas on top of it. And then these alphas give tremendous amount of detail through it. And basically just culling it out. And so to cull it out, I come over and use this offset. And now you can see that I've cut out the black portions of that tube, and now I have these rings, right? And so now I can change the pattern here, and I have all these rings all the way through that tube. Now if I hit OK here, you can see now it's updated on my mesh. And so now I'm getting this kind of effect on the surface here. And all I did was add surface noise, and then in the surface noise area here, I just changed this offset. So if I change this back to 0, you can see this is what I had. But if I start changing it, it's gonna offset it out, and then now it's culling that portion there. Now at this stage, this is purely a rendering preview right now, so none of this is baked in. Now I come over here and I click apply to mesh, and just isolate this part. But you see this is what I'm gonna get, right? So it didn't quite apply the offset. So instead of clicking apply to mesh to this, what I can use is a process that will allow me to take the surface noise, and it's gonna give me a mesh result based on what it would be if it was rendered. And that's in the geometry tab here, and it's called convert BPR to geo. Now when I click this initially, ZBrush is going to look at that surface noise, and then it's gonna come all the way down here at the bottom to the display property, and there's a BPR setting here, and then there's a 3D max noise resolution slider here. Now this slider down here is going to tell ZBrush, hey, if you've got surface noise on this mesh, divide it up around 8 times to get that resolution, and then apply it when you render. And so this, if I come up and do BPR to geo now, it's going to take the mesh, it's going to divide it up, and then apply the surface noise. And then this is now going to give me a mesh that looks like this. So this is now true geometry, extremely dense true geometry. So it's gone up to 4 million, and you can see it's gone through, and this is all real geometry in here. So this is a little bit too dense. So what I want to do, instead of dividing it that much, is I want to modify that max noise slider down here, and I'm going to put it to say at, let's try 2. And then now I'm going to do the convert BPR to geo. This is now going to process that, and now I have this. Let's see how many polygons this has. Gotta zoom in here. So that's looking a little better there. So now I'm only at 1 million polygons there. So still a little bit dense. Let me go down to 1, just one more time here. So question for the what UV application I was using was Hedis UV layout. And then now let's do BPR geo again. Now the reason I'm doing this is because I want the geometry. So we're talking about that this was a project that would potentially be printed. So if you went in and pitched this IP to try to get this greenlit, I want the geometry printed. So right now, as it was just before I turned it to geometry, it was just single-sided, so that would not print. It was basically, it'd be great for rendering, but it's not gonna be good for printing. And so now I've converted this to geometry, and so I have all these polygons here, but you can see it's still thin, right? So the entire mesh here is thin all the way through, and I have double turned on too, so this is still single-sided in terms of the mesh. So what I want to do now is, after I have this converted, is I'm just going to remove the end caps on all these really quick, because they have a little bit of triangles in there because their UV mapping was not set up to really work with the pattern here, and so I don't really need those. So make sure I get rid of all that there. And then after they're gone, I'm going to come up here and delete the hidden parts on that. And now I have this. And now at this stage, I just want to come through and I want to close holes across everything. Now when you click close holes, this is now going to fill all those holes on the mesh here. And now I have these as solid pieces of geometry. So now they have capped all those holes. So at this stage, this whole strippy thing here could definitely be printed out because every single one of these is solid, it's had its holes capped, and it's all a little bit individual geometry islands. So as long as they're embedded into a surface, they're not going to fall out and they should be able to be printed. Now at this stage 2, this is also extremely heavy still. So we're at 887,000 points. So that's a lot of geometry, and you can see that these areas here, since I did it on that low resolution model, isn't smooth all the way through. And I want these to be smooth. I don't want them to have this facetting look. So I'm gonna run this through ZRemesher, and the main reason that I did the process up to now is so I could use ZRemesher. So if I try to ZRemesh this with those holes opened, it's not gonna give me the result I'm looking for. So I wanted to make sure that I came through, closed all the holes, and this correspondingly also gives me a nice polygrouping through these, which I can then use this keep groups option on ZRemesher. And then when I ZRemesh this, let this process here. I'm now going to get this as my result. So you can see it ZRemeshed all these as individual parts here, and it kept those polygroups, so I should have nice straight angles all the way through. Some of the areas like this, that's gonna be okay because it's cloth anyway, we can just chalk it up. But what I can come through here now is I can come in and crease by polygroup, and then now if I apply my dynamic subdivisions, let's fix my mesh here, I now get this. So now I have a lightweight version of that strap thing there. It's going all the way through, and I can put subdivisions on it or dynamic and see the result. So I've gone through and now made that part. Now at this stage, if I want to modify any of these, they're all single islands, so I can definitely still move these and reposition them. Some of these you can see it's going through these different assets because I have armor or other pieces that are occluding those areas. So I wasn't really trying to get it to go around perfectly, because basically if the part's occluded, I just made them and make sure it's embedded rather than going through and trying to have everything 100% correct. And so that is the hose type process I did there. For these little stitching things here, if I come in and just let's see if I can isolate one of those quick. Should have these as polygroups. So we had a question about this. So basically this is what I made. And I just took 2 cubes and then pulled them out, crossed them, and then just moved them up. And so I just ended up with this little shape. Now after I had this little shape, I went up here to brush. I did a create new insert mesh. And this gave me a new brush here. Let me go back to my Proko image. Let me fix this quick. Move him back up here. And then so I made a new brush out of that. And then I went to my armor piece, which was this part. And then you could do this manually if you want. So you could come across and say I wanted to fill in the rest of this hole. I could change my depth in which this is sitting at as well. So in the brush area here, there's a depth setting. So I can embed this to make sure that if it was printed, it would be embedded in the surface. I'm not gonna have stuff floating off in space. And then you could come in and just drag these out like that. So that is one way in which you can do that. So this was sometimes maybe the quickest way to do it. So you can just take them and do them that. You can also duplicate them after this. If you want them to keep the same size, if you draw it out and hold control, it's gonna lock into whatever draw size you have. So I could set this as a constant size, click and drag, and that is now going to allow me to come through and populate these at that size. Now, I went through and did most of this by hand because a lot of the areas in here were not conducive or, you know, really even. So I had a lot of sculptural stuff I went through on the main body here, and so it's kind of not an even surface all the way through. So I just manually went through and did this. There isn't too many areas on the model that had that. So I had this area, and the two arms. So the process didn't take too long. Correspondingly, you could also come to the stroke palette and activate curve mode. And then with curve mode active, you could draw it out as a curve. And then after it's drawn out as a curve, you can move it in position 2 and then play with that as well. So 2 different ways to kind of do that, that process there. I just went and did it manually instead of doing with the curve, because after you have the curve, you kind of have to, you know, work with the curve itself. And sometimes this, for me, works really well, and sometimes it's a little bit more tedious trying to get things to follow exactly one, especially if you have an uneven surface that you sculpted on. So doing it by hand or doing by that is usually my 2 processes. And then if I have a ton of these, like if this whole character was made of these, I'd more than 100% use the curve. But with this, there wasn't that many, so I just did it by hand. Like I wouldn't have placed these by hand. So using that technique with the surface noise is definitely the way to go. For that, I wouldn't have gone through and placed this by hand. That would have just taken way too long. This other part here, this is just a piece that I basically split out. So I took the main body, made a little mask, and then after you have the mask, I just extracted this, which gave me a piece of geometry. And then after I had that geometry, I then just smoothed it out, Z-remeshed it, and then just moved it into the surface. So nothing really too crazy there. And then I'll go in, and with these parts like this, I don't really want them to be even. If they're too even or too kind of straight all the way through, it just doesn't look right. It just looks too computer generated, because anything on cloth, you know, usually, like even if you just look at my arm here, maybe right there, this is all like undulated. It's not a straight line. Like it's got this kind of weird ribbing effect. It's crazy. So I come through and I'll hit this with just a standard brush along the edges, like really quickly like this, and that will just add enough kind of undulation to that surface. And then depending on where you're reading it, you just want it so that the light kind of varies. So as you zoom out, you can come through and have it where it's catching something. If this was really straight, it would look different with that. And then in terms of some of the other things, this is just a Z modeler part I made that just inserted there. And the zipper here is actually an excellent zipper brush that's inside of ZBrush. Let me move my Proko Ranger here. And so these are made by Gert. And so these are excellent. I was in the beta team for Pixologic. It was before I was working for Pixologic. And I was gonna make a zipper brush when the IMM parts came out, and then Gert made these. And I was like, oh yeah, he's got it. They're good. And so for any zipper brushes, I just use these. They're excellent brushes. And so that's what these are kind of pulled out. Now, when I applied these two, I wanted to make sure they're embedded. I didn't want them floating. So if you ever want to print any of these zippers, you need to make sure they're into a surface and not floating out, because those things would not print well. And so you can kind of play with that, but basically you want to make sure all these are kind of embedded in the surface if they're going to be, you know, sticking on the model. So Dougie's asking, did I locate the IMM doll joint brush? Not yet. I got to find it. Next stream, I will have it for you. It's on my list. So I guess next Wednesday, I will have it. I'm not going to promise, but I'm 90% sure I'll have it for you by next Wednesday. All right. So now I'm going to move on to another part, and this was our belt. And let me see what other questions we have here quick. So a question about my computer. Right now I'm on a laptop, and the laptop screen itself actually broke. So I'm running these 2 monitors here for that. I don't have a crazy powerful machine, but basically in terms of what you're looking for in terms of machine is you want first, your 100% top-notch machine is a computer that has high-speed cores, a ton of high-speed cores, a lot of RAM, and an SSD drive. That's your top. If you can get multiple really fast cores and then RAM and SSD drive, ZBrush is gonna love you. Now, second down from that is there's some processes in ZBrush that work really well with multiple cores, and there's some that work really well with single cores. So high cores and say like not as many are going to give you a decent job too, but then also many cores, but maybe not as fast, will give you a good job as well. So it just kind of depends on the thing there, but basically your CPU is what it's looking at. It's not looking at your graphics card. So you can buy that 1080 Ti, we're above 1080 Ti's now, but basically you can go and get the top of the line, and ZBrush is just going to be like, oh, great. But for your processors, make sure high speed cores, and a lot of them are going to be your go-tos, and then RAM and SSD drives. So hopefully that helps. So like Syrup's saying, yes, you can make 2 polygroups there and then use frame as well, and then that will allow you to get that line going through the center too. So that's what I'm going to show here with these belts that we're going to end up doing too. So here I have my belts, and these were the initial ones that I had. Let me see if I got this guy still up here. Maybe not, maybe not. Yeah, these were initial blockout ones I had, so these are just these belts here, and I basically just took those and then I just threw them in their own file. So just living by themselves. Now when I made these, I made them with just cylinders, and the case for this was that I knew that I wanted to modify them. I also knew that I wanted to print them. If I did them with an inner circle or an inner hole in here, which would be what a belt normally is, if I go to print this, I'd have to fill in that hole. So keeping them kind of flat as just cylinder objects was a lot quicker than going through and modifying, you know, a part that's already got a hole cut in it. So oftentimes I'll do that just for belts. Now another thing with this being a single polygroup is now I can play with the, or a single sphere here, cylinder, is I can play with the dimensions too, and I can use the Z modeler brush to change these. So if I want to say come through and offset this, I can do a flat island move, and now I can make these belts shorter right here, like I can make them skinnier, right? So if I don't want them as wide, I can come through and make them skinnier on each side. And then this process will also repeat, so I can tailor one, and then if I click on the other one, it's going to update. So that's another reason why I'll try to keep things as primitives, especially cylinder objects like belts, as long as possible, because I can still manipulate that form and change it and use the Z modeler brush just to make different assets. So for the belt here, going back to kind of the concept here and my ideas behind it, you know, dealing with that depth and those pixels, is I wanted to make some of these little weights, right? So he had this belt, and I wanted to make a weight belt out of these, right? So he has, you know, he's dealing with these depth, he's dealing with these pixels, and I wanted to come in and make sure that he had this way he could, you know, increase that neutral buoyancy. So I had that rig across his top, which is the air bladder, and then also now I have these weights on his belt, and this allows him to keep neutral in these depths that he's going to grab these pixels. So for this, I just created a simple cube. So I came through and just appended a polysphere here, and then I converted this to a quick cube. And so there's my little cube there. And then I just took this and just roughly positioned it where I wanted it to be. And this doesn't have to be exact at this stage because it's going to change as I kind of modify it, but I just wanted like the overall kind of dimensions. And then after I have these dimensions, I use the Z modeler brush, which is a ZBrush's poly modeling toolkit. And in here I can come through and just describe, you know, a quick shape. Now if I want this to be mirror and welded, so this is equal on top and bottom, I come up to my geometry tab up here and use my modify topology and mirror and weld in each of these axes to make sure that my, well, let me turn on local symmetry first, I'm off center here, is all evened out. And so basically that will allow me to give me now, wherever I add an edge, it's going to add on the other side, and it's going to keep this mirrored and this mirrored and then this mirrored as well, all in the same thing. So that's just using local symmetry, which is available here. And since it's a cube, it's going to find those symmetry points, and then I can just mirror it all the way across. So after I have these, I came through and I just added a few edges in here, and then I removed some too. So I went in back to the QMesh action and then just tagged them with an alt polygroup and then just removed them out of that surface. And then I'd come through and, you know, delete those edges there. Now for this shape over here, it's pretty simple, right? You're basically a cube. And then you can see it has this kind of area where the belt would feed through, and then that surface where the belt would be on top of is going to be lower than the outer surface. So there's a few ways you could achieve this. I could try to push these points down to get them, but the easiest way on this mesh was just to come through and extrude out everything but this point here. So I could just come through and tag these quick, and then now extrude this out, and now I have that shape, right? And then after I have this, I can now play with my depth of my object here. So that's a little bit too deep, so I'm gonna come back. Oh, that's a diving joke, too deep. One interesting thing for the first Ghost Recon, so just one of the video games that I worked on in starting my career, was anytime one of these elite special forces soldiers would go near water, they'd go, too deep, too deep. So much funny. All right, so now that I have this shape, I can now start playing with creasing. So if I hit my dynamic subdivision option, I'm gonna get this. And so I want this a little bit straight through here. So I can come in now and just apply some creasing. You can do this with edge looping too. So if I just add some edges in here to my mesh, you can see it's gonna start solidifying this. So you can use creasing or edge looping, it doesn't really matter. And as you do this, you'll be able to kind of get these to be a little bit harsher. So something like that. Now I want these outer edges round, and I wanted kind of these inner ones kind of kept in this radius here. And once again, I do that mirror and weld again to make sure everything's all nice and mirrored. And then there I have my little kind of diving plate there. Now the next thing I want to do is I want to add a little bit of a taper to this, so it's not flat. These would be rounded a little bit because they're going to be going on a belt. And I'd end up using the deformers for this. So there's a bend arc deformer here. This just lives in the Gizmo 3D. And in here I can find my angle here, and I can just bend this a little bit. Just get a little bit of that surface bend there. And then I can give this all one polygroup, and then now I've got that little piece. Now after I have that kind of modeled, now what I want to do is I want to take this and turn it into a brush. So I'm going to come over here, I'm going to do that. Let me move my window here. Create insert mesh. It's going to be a new insert mesh brush here. So I got that little diving part there. Now I want to go back to my belt, and I have another version here that's a little bit thinner. And with this, you can see I have this edge loop that I've established in the middle. So what I can do now with this edge loop is I can come through and I can break this off so that the top and the bottom have two different polygroups. So I'm gonna go back to my Z-Modeler brush, I'm gonna polygroup this, and then make sure this one has a separate one. And then we'll select these two, give that the same polygroup, and these two the same polygroup. If I can actually click on it. Let's get my clicking right. Oh, I got too many polygroups there. All right, let me give this the same polygroup. Polygroup. Now we got those. And so basically I'm just using this process where I'm taking and splitting the model for this belt into two polygroups. So I have a top polygroup and a bottom polygroup. And I'd want to do this on both of these as well. So making sure that these polygroups are the same there, and then making sure that these polygroups are the same. And now after I have all these, I now have my insert mesh brush selected. So I could draw these out like normal and get them drawn out all the way around my belt. But what I can do now instead of that is I can come up to the stroke palette, I can activate curve mode, and then now I could use this and draw them out as a curve. And it also appears I need to rotate my insert mesh part here quick. Wait for it. So instead of drawing that out around this model here, I come up to the stroke palette again, and there's a curve function called frame mesh. And so I can set this to only be polygroups, and now when I click frame mesh, it's going to give me a curve across. And now if I click, oops, let me get my brush size right. Oh, where is my stroke? Make sure you have curve mode active, people. Now I'm going to get this drawn out. And this will follow that curve all the way around. So now I can play the draw size a little bit here. So I wanted it to be about a little bit bigger than that. Let's do 64. And now I have these populated around my belt. Now these are sticking out a little bit too much, so I want to kind of embed them a little bit. So I'm going to change my depth over here. I need to move this somewhere where it's not blocking. Let's move it over there. And we're going to embed it a little bit there. Let's try that. So that's looking better there. And now that I have this going around, I can now split this off into unmasked points, which gives me this. I can then activate my dynamic. And so I can see all those parts there. And now I can come through and do a auto groups. And now I can remove the ones that I don't want. So I can remove all these ones here that would be occluding the other one and would not really be working. I can space these out a little bit as well. So maybe he's got something like that. And then across the top, let's turn my belt back on. Let's get rid of some of these too. And so there I have those, and I delete hidden on those now. And then apply my creasing for my belt. And then there we have our belt with those different things added. Now with the belt too, what I end up doing with this is I'll go in and I'll sculpt the belt itself too, just to add a little bit of noise and variation on this. At this stage, it's just a very simple polygon model. So I'll usually end up applying it and then I'll divide it up a little bit. And then I'll take my move brush and I'll pull out these little parts through here to make sure that each one of these is going through those loops. And I do that all the way around my belt there. And then I also come in and I go down to subdivision and I'll end up sculpting across these as well. And basically this is another just adding variation. So these don't have to be precise. It's just adding a little bit of surface noise so it's not looking like it's a cylinder. And so oftentimes this is basically all it is. I'll come in and hit just that much of it. And then I'll go back in and trace the outer edge with the standard brush again. And I'll go through all the way around the belt and do this. You could do this with some panel looping too, but oftentimes it depends how much there is to do. There's a lot of this belt that's occluded, so it's not really too crazy. So it's actually pretty quick to go through and do that. And then you can see that will now give me that difference there, and that's pretty much my process for the belts there. All right, let's see what we got for questions. Daisuke's probably been busy here. Let me scroll up here. So I got one question on creating leather textures out of the surface noise plugin. So you can always bring in textures. So if you want a leather texture across something, definitely if you have a model that's unwrapped, just bring in a pattern. It just has to be white and black, basically a grayscale alpha. And so just load that in. As long as it's tiling, it's gonna tile nice all the way across. For leather stuff, what I usually end up doing too is I'll apply like a base one on everything. And then I don't know if I have them here or not. There's like some of these scratchy alphas you can use, like this leather skin alpha. And I'll take that and load this in on a standard brush. You need to make sure you have enough topology. But then for leather stuff, oftentimes dragging it out is a lot quicker than say applying it in terms of texture detail. So you can quickly come through, and if my dragging process is working here. This isn't the most perfect alpha, but this would be what I'd probably end up doing that, or you could even use the spray stroke and apply that across. And that usually ends up being a little bit quicker than trying to get the tiling alpha to come through and modify and keep the exact resolution and make sure it tiles correctly. You can often just, for leather, it's really easy to paint it in. And leather also, doing it like this keeps it a little bit less computer generated because you're doing it and it's gonna be random every time you do it. So the spot here isn't gonna look like the spot over there. So one little thing there with the alpha. But yes, I often use the noisemaker with custom alphas. Let's see what else. So Mary's asking, when she makes a curve brush and turns on weld and stretch, it doesn't really weld. So the thing with the welding is that first you need to have enough kind of resolution around. If you're trying to do a flat plane, it's not going to weld. And then the other thing you need to think of it as open holes. So if I wanted to say take this part and let's turn this into a brush where we can weld. So I'm going to remove this and then hit Control W and then grab the top part. And so this is now 3 parts. So I have 3 parts through here. Now if I go to brush and I do create new insert mesh, it's going to give me this. And now let's get a sphere here. And now I go to stroke. Why are you not giving me curve mode? Oh, because you're not a poly mesh. There we go. Activate curve mode, and then in the brush area over here, in the modifiers, turn on weld points and stretch. And this should now come through and it's going to generate that top, it's going to generate the bottom, and then all these individual parts here should be welded. So just make sure when you create your brush that you do it with open holes. So that's the main thing there for getting the surfaces to kind of weld together. If I just came through and broke these into 3 different parts and they were solid, I had these like surfaces like this that were closed, it wouldn't do the weld. But you can come through and these are, you know, all separate parts through here in terms of what ZBrush sees. And so it's these holes that it's looking for, and that's what it's going to try to weld together. So that could be why the welding process isn't working. So if you have something that's just flat geometry, like you're trying to do a single flat thing, it won't weld. And then also make sure you don't have your ends closed, and then the weld should work. Saeed's asking, how can I create a custom tri-parts brush and use it in different sizes? So the tri-parts brush, the main thing with it, it will go crazy if you try to use that at a really large size, and that's often because your tri-parts pieces are different sizes. So if you keep your tri-parts pieces, the top, middle, and the bottom, all the same size, then the brush is going to handle a lot better. If you have a really large top, a really small middle, and then a really large bottom, then that's where you're going to get crazy things happening. Because it's going to generate your curve size based on that first part, and then if your one in the middle is really tiny, it's going to generate the curve basically on that same size. So try to keep your tri-parts brushes all equal in terms of dimensions, and then that brush is going to work a little bit better. Let's see what else is here. Swanky's asking, do you hollow out the belts too, or do you leave them filled like they are now? I usually leave them filled. If they're going to just be belts and seen on a character as they are, I usually keep them filled. So here, let's see what we got here. So I do want to show how I did the shoulder pad stuff, and I think that's the last one. So let me see. Let me do that quick, and then I'll show you all the pieces together, and I'll show you how the belts, I have them, and I kind of left them for the 3D printing stuff. For this being live, it definitely will be replayed on our YouTube channel, so you can definitely re-watch this. So there is, yes, I do go on a lot of tangents and cover a lot of information, so I hope I'm not confusing you guys too well. Okay. So now that's pretty much how I did the belts for the characters, and then after that was done, I then just merged it on my posed model there. Now for the shoulder pad, this was another one. Let's draw him out here. What do I got going on here? Where are we at? Where are we at? So the shoulder pad, initially it was one of the things kind of in Scott's design that I wasn't sure if I was going to keep or not. And he had a few iterations in his version 2. And so the one I really liked was kind of more rounded, and it had these kind of like ports on it as well. And while I was thinking about the design of the character too, I knew I wanted him to kind of suck up pixels. He has this weapon that kind of sucks them up, and then he can spray these back out. And so with this, as I was, messing with, let me find out where I thought I had let's load that guy back in. I was messing with this kind of design. Basically, I knew I had this gun and I wanted to have some sort of like pixel vortex, sucking pixels in, and then he'd also shoot them out. And with this, I was also thinking the idea of, well, what if he doesn't shoot and he sucked all these pixels in? They've got to go somewhere, right? And so this is where I go into the kind of the plausible nature of it. Well, how does he vent these out so they don't just, stay in there like in a gigantic pixel capacitor, and then like his little buddy here touches it and then his little buddy explodes? We don't want that. So these pixels have to be expelled somewhere. And so I was reading some of the Altered Carbon books, and there was one character that had vents on his back. And so I messed with a few designs with vents coming off the back that would say expel these pixels if they were contained, and then he didn't shoot with them or use them, so they could be vented out. And I tried a few different designs on that, and I didn't like any of them. And so then I went back to the shoulder pad, and with the shoulder pad, I thought, well, okay, I can do something where it'll connect to the pack that's sucking in the pixels, and then this now can have vents on the shoulder pad. And so the shoulder pad would end up shooting out the vents on that. So it's taking it and it's gonna express those out from the model. So that's kind of where I went with the shoulder pad design. And for the shoulder pad, it was, this design is also, it's very rounded, and I wanted to keep the form simple. So I'm just gonna go through the process of this because it's actually pretty fast, just to get the initial shape and the design. So for this, I just started with a sphere, and then I used the Gizmo 3D, and I just held down Control and then came across one of these scaling options, and this will allow you to perform a clip. So I could just clip this up, and then I could clip it from the other side as well. So clip this here and clip this here, and this is kind of my initial shape for the shoulder pad I did on the initial model. So something very simplistic. It's just a round pad. Now to develop this further, I like the initial design, but I wanted to come in and I wanted to slice it up and clean it up a little bit. So the first thing I did with this is, since it's just a deformed sphere, I wanted to come through and just add some polygripping to this. So I used the slice curve brush here, and I just sliced these edges off quick. And when you do this, it will also give you new polygroups. So I've now gone through and sliced the model into these chunks, and this allows me to isolate this part of the mesh. Now after I have this part isolated, what I can do now is I can delete hidden on this. And now I can Z-remesh this part. So I'll run that through Z-remesher. And you can see it's gonna give me this really nice and clean geometry. And I'll run this through a few times, so I usually do it just once, just to get the initial shape, and then I'll just use half and keep running it a few times until I get something a little low resolution, so that's pretty good there. And then after I had that shape, I came down here and I would flip it, so I just get the inverted side of it, because I knew I had that initial shape that I made. I had it at the right size and the right scale made out of that sphere. So I basically just took that, put it into its own scene, sent it into the world, and now I can model it the way I want to. And so I switched back to the Z-modeler brush again. I then Q-meshed all the polygons here. Make sure all polygons are selected. And so then I just added some thickness to it. And so this gave me the thickness shape for that shoulder pad. Now with the shoulder pad too, in general, if it was in real life, it would be thin, right? So it'd have a thin exoskeleton around it. It'd probably have some straps that would go into it, but it wouldn't be probably this thick. Now I did it this thick in terms for 3D printing. So if I want to print this out, I want to make sure that shoulder pad's embedded in the arm. I don't want to have a thin shoulder pad that then now I have to go back in and backfill to connect to the arm. So a lot of the stuff I did on this model too was involving kind of these thickness properties. Like the outer shape would be this. His arm may be coming up to here in the shoulder pad, but I made sure that I extended it down deeper so it ends up connecting and generating a connection point across that entire arm. So I don't have to do a lot of cleanup for 3D printing. So after I had this set up like this, I then wanted to add a little beveling through here. So I went back up to the crease area here. And in the crease area, there's a bevel width slider. And if you hold down the Control key and then click and drag, this is going to look at the polygrouping you have, and it's going to apply a bevel between those polygroups. So this allowed me to come through and quickly get a bevel across that polygrouped area, which then gave me this nice kind of area in here. And then now I could crease by polygrouping and then activate dynamic subdivisions, and that ended up being my shoulder pad. So that's the process I did there for that. Now after I had that shoulder pad, I then went in and I created this little part here. So I needed a vent, and so I created this little shape with the Z-Modeler brush as well. So this is just very simplistic Z-Modeler modeling. I just took a simple cylinder. I then used the Alt-click to kind of tag different edges on this with symmetry and radial active. And so this allowed me to come through, I don't know if I'm in the right axis here, and I can do this tag stuff really quickly. And then after these are tagged, I can then Q-mesh these parts in and out to add different elements to it. So a very fast way to model anything kind of cylindrical inside of ZBrush. And then after I had that set up, I then just applied dynamic subdivision just to get that final look out of it. Now, when I had this done, what I did next was I started to take these and kind of place them on my shoulder pad. So if I come over here and turn this on. And so I just started to place them in a kind of a symmetrical fashion to see how they're looking. So I ended up doing 2 on the outside and 2 down the middle. And this ended up being the kind of shoulder pad look here. Now at this stage too, I wasn't sure if I wanted to add any more details to the pad too, because I had a lot of details in the cloth stuff that I was adding in. And so some surfaces on the mesh, I just didn't want to over flood with stuff. And I could always come back in later and add more details as needed. It's a lot harder to remove details than it is to add details, especially in terms of like surface noises and surface textures on a mesh. So let me see what we got here. So there's no schedule for me and Paul in the clubhouse yet, but at some point I'm sure it will happen. I don't know if I'll be going into too much rendering here. I've got some rendered scenes, but I won't be going into the rendering process today. So Mary's asking the tileable texture option for the environment stuff. That was one of the Z Classroom videos. It's the tilde key on your keyboard. So if you're in 2.5D mode and you hold down the tilde key, that will end up allowing you to scroll the canvas, and then it'll give you a tiling pattern. I know. There's nothing on my coffee today. It's kind of empty. I left my my water bottle at home, so I had to get a coffee mug, and it's just water in there. I'm not awake enough. If it was coffee, I'd be wide awake. All right, so now the things you're all waiting for here. So I think I got one more. I got one more trick. I lied. So here is what I ended up with for the compression hammer. So for this asset here, I used all the Z-Modeler brush, or not Z-Modeler, yeah, Z-Modeler and live booleans. So I didn't do any sculpting on this. It's a lot of primitives, a lot of assets, and then I just used the live boolean. So this is still in the live boolean stage here. And you can see when I use live boolean, I just kind of haphazardly start cutting stuff out. I have a bunch of floating parts. I mean, this has got 50 subtools through here. They're not really named. And that's just kind of how I go through and just model stuff. Like I'm looking for the shapes, I'm looking for the design, and I'm not concerned about the cleanliness of the file at this stage. I will go back in and kind of clean everything up at the end, but to start off, it's just chaos. And it's just kind of how it needs to be, because if I don't like anything, I can just go delete it, remove it, and just get rid of it. And so yes, the gun right now is in a separate file too. So oftentimes I'll build, as I mentioned earlier, I usually separate everything out. And this just allows me to focus on one thing, and then I can take it, and when I'm finished it, then I can throw it in the other mesh. Oftentimes too, we'll take my models, the finished parts of ones, and I'll do a decimated version of that entire mesh. So that mesh as an entirety is very, very lightweight. It's not gonna be the final, but it's a lightweight. And then I can bring that into this scene with the weapon. And so now I have the weapon as I'm building it, but I have my reference that's the decimated model, which is lighter weight. So I'm not working with this 60 million, 70 million polygon scene all the time, because basically I want to break it down into small chunks, and then it lets things go a little faster, And then as I'm working on it, when I finish it, I can then add it to my master file, which has all the high-res parts. So I do a lot of building in different kind of shapes. You'll see my tool palette is usually a hot mess too of all sorts of different things. But so with the gun here, I have these little parts. So basically, I knew I wanted to put these holes in, and these are all put in with a this subtool here. So this is what that kind of looks like. This was just a quick Z modeler part, and then I went through and just started, made a brush out of it, starting adding where I needed it, then just duplicating and moving. And I have it so it's cutting through all the stuff. Now, when I talked about earlier that I didn't fully flesh out the armor early on, because I knew that I was gonna have some sort of rivet or pin mechanism in the weapon, and I wanted to make sure that if I made a hole on the mesh at this size for his gun, when it's in the scene with the full character with his armor, I wanted to make sure that this hole here is the same size as the hole that would be on his armor. So I didn't end up with this gun with all these tiny, tiny, tiny holes, and then the armor has these massive holes in it. So I wanted to make sure that I had that stuff very consistent between the two objects. So one little trick that I'll do when doing this, so I knew I had this negative shape, and then I also have this positive shape to go with it. So I have the negative shape and then the pins, and these are two different parts. So I want one part to cut, and then I want the one part to add. And this gives you the effect that there's a hole, and then there's now a pin sticking through that hole. And later on, in terms of rendering, I can then, apply a different material to those pins and apply a different material to the holes. So now I have this nice contrast between the hole and the pin rather than having those both be the same material. So I'll end up doing a lot of that kind of stuff. Now with this, here I have my part. And when I create the part here, so this was my original part. Let me make sure this is not quite the right file. I lied. So let me get rid of this quick. I had another save that didn't make it, it appears. So here I have my initial part, and then for the pin, it's just a secondary part here. So if I just isolate, let me get back here. Let me get back here. All right, let's do this again. So here I have my subtractive part, and then this little thing is my pin. So what I'm gonna do is, I know that once I placed a cut hole on this model, wherever that cut hole was, I was gonna come back and put in a pin. So rather than going through and placing all my cuts first and then placing all my pins first, what I did was I made a single subtool here that contains both parts. So it has the cut part and also the pin. And so I just took the pin, I've got it where it's seated inside the mesh like that. So I have a cut and a pin, and they're just sitting on top of each other. Now after I had this made, now I turn this into, well, I made sure it was a single subtool, and now I just turn it into a brush. So I do create insert mesh and make a new brush out of that. And now if I go back to my rifle here, we'll use this one. Let's go back to just the main part here. So many little pieces. And you see I also have some random tubing here. You can see my build file. This one's not as clean as, it's not the video cleaned up one. And then let me turn off my holes and my pins. So here's my weapon here without any of this stuff on it. So I made this insert mesh brush. I'd select one of the parts usually on the lower edge of my model here, one that's below in the stack, and I draw this out. So there's my pin part there. You may have to change the depth a little bit. So I go to the brush option here, and I'd go to the depth area and just embed this into the surface. And now if I draw this out, and then I'm gonna split unmasked points on that, and now set it to subtractive, as long as I don't have craziness going on up here. I lied, hold on. I got my order out of control. There you go. It should now be cutting through. Now, as it's cutting through this, I'm doing a horrible job of explaining this right now because I have my order out of control. All right, there we go. And as this is cutting through, you see it's only displaying that one hole. right? So wherever I put this, I'm just getting the hole. But that other part is still there. So what I can do now is I can go in and isolate just that part that I've added as a subtractive form. I can now hide. Well, actually I need to duplicate first. Let's duplicate that. And on the one part, I can go in and I can hide all the cut things and leave just the holes. And then I can delete hidden on these. And now when I go back, and let me get my creasing going here, because this is totally not the right file. We failed on files here today. I got too much craziness. But basically, now I've done double the work, and basically I don't have to go in and make the positive shapes again across the entire mesh. I totally didn't explain that very well. But it's really cool and it really works well. So just put your positives and your negatives into the same insert mesh brush, draw it out, and then after you have them all placed looking negative, you then go back in, isolate or duplicate that subtool, remove all the negatives, separate them from the positives, and then you'll now have a new subtool that just has all the positives and they're all in the same place. And then it's gonna save you a lot of time so you don't have to go through and place 90 million pins twice on a model. So there you go. So yes, you can convert creasing. You can use the bevel stuff for the creasing, different operations. There's no way to really, you can use panel loops, so you can do polygroups and then add creasing. We had a question asking convert creasing to edge loops. The creasing is always going to be on an edge loop. And then let's see what else we got here. So 3D Studio Max will use creasing. It will use an open subdivision format. And basically if you export the model as an FBX to 3D Studio Max, it'll remember the creasing. ZBrush's creasing is only going to be 0 to 1. So it's only going to do on or off. Max's and Maya's will do a variation of the creasing. So if you take an FBX from ZBrush and import it into Max, it's going to bring it in, and then all that creasing still should be there. And then in Max, bring it as well. But if you change that creasing inside of Max or Maya to say 0.5 or 0.2, when you bring it back into ZBrush, it's always going to be 1. So just remember that when you're going back to force. But you can definitely import and export creasing using FBX to Max and Maya. And I think I have an Ask ZBrush video on that too. Yeah, and Daisuke's on it. Excellent. Randy's asking, FBX, the scale is different when exporting OBJ. It should be not. It should be the same. As long as you're using the export option here, there's an FBX option there. If you are getting a version that's not working the way it should, definitely submit a ticket. If you log up here to the help option up at the top of ZBrush, there's a support link. I'm loading in my file here. Hold on. I should probably load the low ones. Use the plugin export or the export from over here. Check the export over here. The export through the Z plugin tab may be doing something a little bit different, but the export over here should be exporting the same either way. All right, so this is where I ended up with my model, and I've got some renders I can show you guys too. So this was I almost finished everything. The part that I'm missing here is I didn't get to his little buddy up here on his shoulders. There's a few things I probably end up tweaking and changing, but this was the kind of end result of the mesh here. So this is the decimated version of them as well. So as you can see here, we have these holes, and as I was talking about earlier, keeping them the same size. So all the holes on his armor here are the same size as one of the things, and that's one of the things that kind of bothers me oftentimes if I see my models. So I want to make sure that I want things to be kind of consistent in that nature. So if it's a pin, it's a pin. It should relatively be the same size. Talking about the different kind of attributes of depth in here, we've got these kind of compression gloves I went with in terms of his gloves himself. So I went with the kind of NASA ball finger type things on the edge of his fingers there, and then I kept them with this kind of compression seal that goes around. And then just to enhance that believability, I've added this little screw taper on the end of them, and the same kind of thing you can see is mimicked in the part that holds the canister on the back of his pack as well. These little items in here I'm still not 100% sure of, but I did put some in the weapon as well, so that design is mimicked across those. His rebreathing type bladder type apparatus is fed through hoses, so it has a way to kind of inflate or deflate as he's in this depth, and then they're all fed into his canister collection here. The ports for his wires, they all have connectors kind of built through them so they could be plugged or unplugged, because you wouldn't want to have the pack connected to the weapon 100% of the time. There's also an extra port, so making sure that that port looks like it has something inside of it so that can plug into. And then as you can see in his shoulder pad, it went with that exhaust type functionality. Now, instead of keeping these exhaust ports like the same and just plugging something into it, I made sure that I replicated the same ports all over the place. So this port design here is the same as the ones that go in the shoulder and to his pack, just keeping that stuff kind of consistent. You can see the final weight belt that went through in there. And then I used those kind of elements of a weed eater, kind of weed whacker handle design system for his trigger. So it has like, you know, the monetary button you press on the back, and then you have the one that pulls the trigger that would end up feeding the pixels through his weapon and discharge the gun. And then the horns and everything else, but that's the end kind of version of his mesh there. The little guy I haven't finished yet. I need to add some more love into him. He's a basically another character himself. So I wanted to have him the same kind of love and the end stuff with the character as well. Since he is so small, I want to make sure that the details on him are as coherent as the rest. So I don't want to put like all these crazy micro details on him and then have him have this like far detailed look than everything else. And so that's another kind of thing to go with him just being so small. It's another kind of thing that is potentially difficult because he's tiny. You want the same amount of details that you've put in the rest of the model, but you don't want to over put the amount of details. So there's a little cross play there that I haven't fully thought out what I'm going to do about that yet. Let's see, we got questions here. So many questions. So I had a question about posing a model after decimation. So basically, if you decimate something and it's got long triangles, you're not going to be able to pose that thing. You could slice it up and try to do it, but basically ZRemeshed models are going to be a lot easier to pose. You can always just pose them and then put them down on that lower subdivision level and do them. And then I recommend using the Z-sphere method for that posing too. It's going to be a lot simpler. Let's see what else we got here. So the main hose detail connected to his back, basically this was just a hose, and then I just applied some surface noise to it. And then I used just a curve brush to do that, and then just manipulated those curves and placed it. The details on this hose too, you can modify those as well. These I did a process, instead of using surface noise, I took a texture, applied it to the hose, and then after the texture is applied, what you can end up doing is in the UV map area, there's an adjust option right here in the create menu. And so if the part has UVs, you can repeat the pattern. And so kind of think of it as like, you're not just using that alpha, like in surface noise, if you take an alpha and you apply it, you can scale it, but it's going to scale it in its constraints. So it's going to scale it as a square, up or down. You're going to get large, you're going to get small. If you use this option where you apply it as a texture, and then you can adjust that texture using these H repeat and V repeat options. This is going to allow you to get offset scaling on that texture. And so you can end up then taking it. And so for this hose here, my UVs were, square, but I wanted that repeating process to have it look like it's a lot more. So I just adjusted the H repeat over here. And then after that's adjusted, you can then take that map and bake it into the poly paint of your model. Then you can mask by that poly paint and then inflate. And that's how I got this detail through here. But if I would have done surface noise with this, I wouldn't have had to make a new alpha basically because it wouldn't have tiled correctly. So instead of doing that, I just applied it as a texture and then changed the repeat function and then masked, and then baked that texture in, masked by the texture, and then inflated. And then if I go here, these are some of my kind of test renders. So we talked about, I do a lot of this as I'm working as well. So I'll send my model constantly to Keyshot. So these are some of the initial ones when I was messing with the pixel stuff. The pixel stuff I'm still not 100% happy with. I have some versions down here you can see, but this was the you know, the quick Keyshot renders that I'll do. And I usually have Keyshot up and running while I'm using ZBrush. So anytime I can just send my model over and see what it looks like, just to make sure I was getting things done. I was messing with the kind of design elements. This is why I had that floating text in my helmet part 2, because I knew I wanted to have this translucent effect. I didn't want to expose a model underneath it, but some of the, you know, initial references and stuff I was thinking of was just more like glowy stuff, right? So I knew I wanted ZBrush, and then this 0.701 is a magical number in Z scripting. So for sliders, it's a magical number. So that was another kind of inside thing there. And then I went to more of like an orange type tone that I liked a lot better. And so a lot of these are just kind of those kind of things through there. So this is towards the end of the process. So oftentimes when I'll do this, I'll make sure I checked, you know, what things are looking like. I didn't want to put, you know, crazy patterns across everything because I wanted a break in terms of where things are. Like I could have added a bunch of surface noise to the gloves, but it was going to contrast a lot with this kind of ribbed pattern through here. And this ribbed pattern also, I had it mimicking the hose later on. So I just didn't want to overkill a lot of the things there. And I definitely wanted to add, I was thinking about adding a lot of like kind of rubber effects for like this inflatable kind of area he's got around his neck, but it might have just been too saturated in terms of details yet. So I just kind of left it as it was. And then you can see here's those line tracings I'll do on the sculptural stuff just to kind of break that out. Now, if this was not there, it wouldn't look as interesting, right? So just coming in and just adding just that little cut, it didn't take long. And you see now it has a little more dynamic to the side there. And then these were some of the kind of playing with the pixel stuff, trying to get its kind of effect. The funny thing with this, I'll show you this guys in a minute here. It looked kind of like a squid after I did it, like an octopus, which played into the depth stuff. But here's the back, just checking on that. I really like this aspect, and I didn't add a lot more of these rings. I wanted to add, I couldn't find a place to add him that I liked up on the top. So I think if he's down in the depths, he may need to get pulled out. So I wanted a few more of these D-rings, but I didn't find a home for him. And then that was another render there as well. And I think I have a few more of these. Let's get this. Yeah, so this was another kind of play on the pixel stuff. These I started tapering them out a little bit more to get more of the thing there. And then this little part here, let's see if he's in this scene or not. As I was doing these, this one was funny. So this is that ground one, and subconsciously it looks like it's an octopus. It's just kind of smeared all over the floor. So I don't know why that happened, but I think I'm gonna go in and mess with these a little bit more and try to get more of that wispy nature out of it. And then definitely I will go back in and kind of break these out into different materials. I kind of ran out of time in terms of the kind of 3-stream thing, and then also finished the little guy in his shoulder. So, but that's where I ended up with this. And for the pixelated effect, we got a question about that. This is all just using, there's a remesh option. So if I just take this little glow one here, and I'm just gonna clone it so it's on its own thing. And if you take this and you go to the subtool remesh area here, there's a remesh all button. So you want to turn this polish all the way down. And let me get a solo here too. I don't know why I'm not getting a slider here. I done broke it. Have something hidden? Oh, well. And if you remesh this, I don't know why my resolution slider is grayed out. May be a problem. We may be into crash land. We done killed it. Yeah, there's something goofy going on there. Let's try that again. Yeah, so basically there's a button that'll just turn everything to Minecraft. Click it, Minecraft. That's it, you're good. So I'll show you that again quick on that. But I think that's close to the end of the stream here. So I'll show this remesh one really quick, and then we'll go through my final spiel here. So it definitely was a fun project to work on, and I want to thank Proko and Scott for doing it with us. let's do this quick. Glow clone. So you just take a subtool and you go to the remesh area here. There we go, now I got my button. And here you can set a resolution. I think 200 was what I was doing here. And basically we'll take anything that's visible in your subtool area here, and when you click remesh, it's going to turn it into pixels. And then for this, I had the pixel option, and then I took the pixels and I kept the glow one underneath. And so I usually do this kind of process where I'll do an emissive underneath the object and then another surface that's translucent on top of it. And that kind of gives me that glow effect. So that's kind of how this stuff is kind of coming out. And I'd still tweak this a lot more because I want it to be brighter underneath where the turbine is, and then have it kick out and get a more variant of gradient through the back of the stuff there. And then this back one I'm still not too happy with as well, but that's where we're at. Let's see what else we got here, question-wise. Thank you, Daisuke, for going through it and looking this all up for me and answering all these questions. All right, so that was the final stream here for the Pixologic and Proko collaboration. If you guys have not heard of Proko, definitely check out his channel. He has a ton of art tutorials and reference stuff. It's a great asset, especially if you're doing any sort of art, so I highly recommend you check it out. I'm gonna put the links in the chat here. So we teamed up with Proko to do this collaboration, and so Scott was the first one to kind of work on this, and he did his spiel here. There he is there asking me, what did you do to my model? All right. And so definitely check out his first initial video, and then I did 3 corresponding streams to this, going through the process of taking his initial design and then working on it some more, kind of collaborating with it to generate a more fleshed out kind of thing. And with Scott's design, the whole premise was that I told him, you know, keep it loose because I want to go through and play with it and have fun as well. So it definitely wasn't a 100% match, but that was never the intention. But that's kind of like how I enjoy working nowadays as well. The kind of mentality of, here's the exact front back side view, make it look exactly like it. Just, I've done that too much over the years, and now it's towards the end of my career in game stuff. It was more in the prototyping and development phases, which I found a lot more enjoyable. So definitely had a lot of fun with that. In terms of other stuff as well, for us here at ZBrush, if you want to try ZBrush, we have a trial. You can come over here to the Pixologic trial page here. We have a free trial for 30 days, non-restrictive. It's gonna be the same application you saw me using today. So all the bells and whistles are in there, and you can use it for 30 days for free. With the learning of it, we have a bunch of tutorials you can visit on our Z Classroom site. So if you do a search for Z Classroom, this will bring up a whole bunch of free training that you can get started in ZBrush, and these will allow you to log in here. You can start and stop videos and remember where you're at, all sorts of different stuff, and there's a ton of advanced and different courses in here. If you had missed yesterday's event where we had Maddie Spencer, she did a ZBrush Master Series with us. She also has an excellent tutorial on her through Gnomon. Let me see if I can find her on here. Where's calendar? And so if you come to Pixologic or go to ZBrushLIVE and then click on the calendar tab at the top here, you can find a link to Maddie Spencer's stream here. And if you click on that, she goes through some of her stuff as well, but she has a great tutorial series on Gnomon you can check out as well on an introduction to ZBrush that I highly recommend. So Maddie is a great ZBrush instructor. And then coming on today after me, we have Ashley Adams, and she'll be streaming live on our Twitch channel here as well. Another great ZBrush artist. And once again, we're in this live kind of mentality on Twitch here. You can definitely ask questions and we'll try to answer them. So that's kind of the whole benefit of this, to try to get, you know, if you guys are just starting to learn ZBrush, you know, someone that's interested in ZBrush, you know, have them come over, have them download the trial. They can start messing with the software. If they have questions, just pop into one of these streams. We have a ton of them. It's pretty much someone streaming at least multiple times a day, and oftentimes for hours. So Ashley's gonna go here from 3 p.m. to 7. So you have a wide range of time where you can go in there and ask your questions to Ashley, and she can help you out on there. So A-Cubed, great stuff. We have one question here about the striped suit texture. I'm not gonna be able to go through and demonstrate it, but I can quickly tell you how it was done. So basically I took this model here and this one doesn't have my subdivisions on it, but I sculpted it first, and then I generated a ZRemeshed version of it, and then with that I just unwrapped it. And it doesn't have to be the cleanest unwrap, because basically all I was concerned about was that these stripes follow in this certain direction. I didn't care about anything else. So I just needed this area of the model to have UVs that were going in the same direction. Didn't care what direction, they just needed to be going in the same direction. And so I just took the model, I broke it out into chunks, into those 3 chunks, and then I just unwrapped those. The rest of the UVs were garbage. And then I went and used the surface noise and applied it in those areas. And so that's how I got that kind of ribbing stitching there. I also have a Ask ZBrush video that covers that as well. Let's see if I can get that I can link to you, which goes through the entire process. If I can find it here. I've done so many of these. It was like a Spider-Gwen type suit. Let's see. Oh look, here's one for enhancing sculptural details we were talking about earlier. But anyway, there's one that, here it is, noise patterns. Here you go. I'm sending you this. So watch that one. It'll go through the process, basically the same thing I did on this. And so it's taking after I get to this ad here. Oh, the solar power bank. And it'll go through the process of how I kind of work and use it. And then it's basically just set into polygroups. I'll break them out, and then I'll use morph targeting and noisemaker to decide where I want these, and then you can go back in and remove them where you don't want them as well. So it's a handy little thing to come through. And basically, if you're doing anything like this, you basically just want to make sure that those patches are all the same, right? You can have it where the UVs are weird, you know, like this one could be rotated there, this one rotated here, but you want those patches to all be consistent. And so you don't care about really anything else other than that patch where that surface texture is going to be applied. Well, thank you all again for coming out, and definitely hop over to Proko's YouTube channel there and check out the Scott Flanders video. Once again, this was a collaboration with Pixologic and Proko. Next week I will be streaming again, and it will be on a different topic. I'm thinking about, probably won't be next stream, but stream after that, I do kind of want to go back into this model and revisit it for setting up keys and how I go by splitting stuff up for 3D printing, because I do want to end up printing this model out as well. And so I'll probably go through the process of doing that in one of my streams too, because there's a lot of cut ups and things like that. And definitely check out the Proko video. And this was the last one. So this is stream 3 in the collaboration. So if you haven't checked out the other ones, you can definitely come over to ZBrushLIVE. And in here we have links to the first stream and the second stream. They're all available on our YouTube channel. And then we also have some more information on Proko as well, so you can check out all his sites and stuff. So thank you all, and stay safe, and till the next time, happy ZBrushing. Take care.